This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to find out how you can volunteer, visit librivox.org. This reading by Kevin O'Coin. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 99. The Law. We have seen how quietly Mademoiselle Danglars and Mademoiselle d'Armilly accomplished their transformation in flight, the fact being that every one was too much occupied in his or her own affairs to think of theirs. We will leave the banker contemplating the enormous magnitude of his debt before the phantom of bankruptcy, and follow the Baroness, who, after being momentarily crushed under the weight of the blow which had struck her, had gone to seek her usual adviser, Lucien Debray. The Baroness had looked forward to this marriage as a means of ridding her of a guardianship which, over a girl of Eugenie's character, could not fail to be a rather troublesome undertaking, for in the tacit relations which maintain the bond of family union, the mother, to maintain her ascendancy over her daughter, must never fail to be a model of wisdom and a type of perfection. Now, Madame Danglars feared Eugenie's sagacity in the influence of Mademoiselle d'Armilly. She had frequently observed the contemptuous the honor of Danglars from ignominious association with the disgraced young man they had presented to the world as their son-in-law. And since Villefort, the friend of Danglars, had acted in this way, no one could suppose that he had been previously acquainted with, or had lent himself to, any of Andrea's intrigues. Villefort's conduct, therefore, upon reflection, appeared to the Baroness as if shaped for their mutual advantage. But the inflexibility of the procureur should stop there. She would see him the next day, and if she could not make him fail in his duties as a magistrate, she would, at least, obtain all the indulgence he could allow. She would invoke the past, recall old recollections. She would supplicate him by the remembrance of guilty yet happy days. Monsieur de Villefort would stifle the affair. He had only to turn his eyes on one side, and allow Andrea to fly, and follow up the crime under that shadow of guilt called contempt of court. And after this reasoning, she slept easily. At 9 o'clock next morning she arose, and without ringing for her maid or giving the least sign of her activity, she dressed herself in the same simple style as on the previous night. Then running downstairs, she left the hotel, walked to the Rue de Provence, hailed a cab, and drove to Monsieur de Villefort's house. For the last month this wretched house had presented the gloomy appearance of a lazaretto infected with the plague. Some of the apartments were closed within and without. The shutters were only opened to admit a minute's air, showing the scared face of a footman, and immediately afterwards the windows would be closed, like a gravestone falling on a sepulchre, and the neighbors would say to each other in a low voice, "Will there be another funeral today at the procureur's house?" Madame Danglars involuntarily shuddered at the desolate aspect of the mansion. Descending from the cab, she appeared at the door with trembling knees, and rang the bell. 3 times did the bell ring with a dull, heavy sound, seeming to participate in the general sadness, before the concierge appeared and peeped through the door, which he opened just wide enough to allow his words to be heard. He saw a lady, a fashionable, elegantly dressed lady, and yet the door remained closed. "Do you intend opening the door?" said the Baroness. "First, madam, who are you?" "Who am I? You know me well enough." "We no longer know anyone, madam." "You must be mad, my friend," said the Baroness. "Where do you come from?" "Oh, this is too much!" "Madame, these are my orders. Excuse me." "Your name?" "The Baroness Danglars. You have seen me 20 times." "Possibly, madam. And now, what do you want?" "Oh, how extraordinary! I shall complain to Monsieur de Villefort of the impertinence of his servants." "Madame, this is precaution, not impertinence. No one enters here without an order from Monsieur d'Avrigny, or without speaking to the procureur." "Well, I have business with the procureur." "Is it pressing business?" "You can imagine so, since I have not even brought my carriage out yet. But enough of this. Here is my card. Take it to your master." "Madame will await my return?" "Yes, go." The concierge closed the door, leaving Madame Danglars in the street. She had not long to wait. Directly afterwards the door was opened wide enough to admit her, and when she had passed through, it was again shut. Without losing sight of her for an instant, the concierge took a whistle from his pocket as soon as they had entered the court and blew it. The valet de chambre appeared at the doorsteps. "You will excuse this poor fellow, madame," he said as he preceded the Baroness, "but his orders are precise, and Monsieur de Villefort begged me to tell you that he could not act otherwise." In the court, showing his merchandise, was a tradesman who had been admitted with the same precautions. The Baroness ascended the steps. She felt herself strongly infected with the sadness which seemed to magnify her own, and still guided by the valet de chambre, who never lost sight of her for an instant, was introduced to the magistrate's study. Preoccupied as Madame Danglars had been with the object of her visit, the treatment she had received from these underlings appeared to her so insulting that she began by complaining of it. But Villefort, raising his hand, bowed down by grief, looked up at her with so sad a smile that her complaints died upon her lips. "Forgive my servants," he said. "For a terror I cannot blame them for. From being suspected they have become suspicious." Madame Danglars had often heard of the terror to which the magistrate alluded, but without the evidence of her own eyesight she could not have ever believed that the sentiment had been carried so far. "You too, then, are unhappy," she said. "Yes, madame," replied the magistrate. "Then you pity me?" "Sincerely, madame." "And you understand what brings me here?" "You wish to speak to me about the circumstance which has just happened?" "Yes, sir, a fearful misfortune." "You mean a mischance." "A mischance?" repeated the Baroness. "Alas, madame," said the procureur with his imperturbable calmness of manner, "I consider those alone misfortunes which are irreparable." "And do you suppose this will be forgotten?" "Everything will be forgotten, madame," said Villefort. "Your daughter will be married tomorrow, if not today; in a week, if not tomorrow; and I do not think you can regret the intended husband of your daughter." Madame Danglars gazed on Villefort, stupefied to find him so almost insultingly calm. "Am I come to a friend?" she asked in a tone full of mournful dignity. "You know that you are, madame," said Villefort, whose pale cheeks became slightly flushed as he gave her the assurance. And truly this assurance carried him back to different events from those now occupying the Baroness and him. "Well, then, be more affectionate, my dear Villefort," said the Baroness. "Speak to me not as a magistrate, but as a friend. And when I am in bitter anguish of spirit, do not tell me that I ought to be gay." Villefort bowed. "When I hear misfortunes named, madame," he said, "I have within the last few months contracted the bad habit of thinking of my own, and then I cannot help drawing up an egotistical parallel in my mind. That is the reason that by the side of my misfortunes yours appear to be mere mischances. That is why my dreadful position makes yours enviable. But this annoys you. Let us change the subject. You were saying, madame—" "I came to ask you, my friend," said the Baroness, "what will be done with this impostor?" "Impostor?" repeated Villefort. "Certainly, madame, you appear to extenuate some cases and exaggerate others. Impostor, indeed! Monsieur Andrea Cavalcanti, or rather Monsieur Benedetto, is nothing more nor less than an assassin. Sir, I do not deny the justice of your correction, but the more severely you arm yourself against the unfortunate man, the more deeply you will strike our family. Come, forget him for a moment, and instead of pursuing him, let him go." "You are too late, madame. The orders are issued." "Well, should he be arrested? Do you think they will arrest him?" "I hope so." "If they should arrest him, I know that sometimes prisoners afford means of escape. Will you leave him in prison?" The procureur shook his head. "At least keep him there till my daughter be married." "Impossible, madame. Justice has its formalities." "What? Even for me?" said the Baroness, half jesting, half in earnest. "For all, even for myself among the rest," replied Villefort. "Ah!" exclaimed the Baroness, without expressing the ideas which the exclamation betrayed. Villefort looked at her with that piercing glance which reads the secrets of the heart. "Yes, I know what you mean," he said. "You refer to the terrible rumors spread abroad in the world, that the deaths which have kept me in mourning for the last 3 months, and for which Valentine has only escaped by a miracle, have not happened by natural means." "I was not thinking of that," replied Madame Danglars quickly. "Yes, you were thinking of it, and with justice. You could not help thinking of it and saying to yourself, 'You, who pursue crime so vindictively, answer now, why are there unpunished crimes in your dwelling?'" The Baroness became pale. "You were saying this, were you not? Well, I own it. I will answer you." Villefort drew his armchair nearer to Madame Danglars. Then resting both hands upon his desk, he said in a voice more hollow than usual, "There are crimes which remain unpunished because the criminals are unknown, and we may strike the innocent because of the guilty, but the culprits are discovered." Villefort here extended his hand toward a large crucifix placed opposite to his desk. "When they are discovered, I swear to you, by all I hold most sacred, that whoever they may be shall die. Now, after the oath I have just taken, and which I will keep, madame, dare you ask for mercy for that wretch?" "But, sir, are you sure he is as guilty as they say?" "Listen. This is his description. Benedetto, condemned, at the age of 16, for 5 years to the galleys for forgery. He promised well, as you see, first a runaway, then an assassin. And who is this wretch? Who can tell? A vagabond, a Corsican. Has no one owned him? No one. His parents are unknown. But who was that man who brought him from Lucca? Another rascal like himself, perhaps his accomplice." The Baroness clasped her hands. "Villefort!" she exclaimed in her softest and most captivating manner. "For heaven's sake, madame," said Villefort, with a firmness of expression not altogether free from harshness, "for heaven's sake, do not ask me pardon for a guilty wretch! What am I? The law. Has the law any eyes to witness your grief? Has the law ears to be melted by your sweet voice? Has the law a memory for all those soft recollections you endeavor to recall? No, madame. The law has a command, and when it commands, it strikes. You will tell me that I am a living being and not a code, a man and not a volume. Look at me, madame, look at me. Have mankind treated me as a brother? Have they loved me? Have they spared me? Has anyone shown that mercy towards me that you now ask at my hands? No, madame, they struck me, always struck me. Woman, siren that you are, do you persist in fixing on me that fascinating eye which reminds me that I ought to blush? Well, be it so. Let me blush for the faults you know, and perhaps for even more than those, but having sinned myself, it may be more deeply than others, I never rest till I have torn the disguises from my fellow creatures and found out their weaknesses. I have always found them, and more. I repeat it with joy, with triumph. I have always found some proof of human perversity or error. Every criminal I condemn seems to me living evidence that I am not a hideous exception to the rest. Alas! 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 All the world is wicked. Let us therefore strike at wickedness." Villefort pronounced these words with a feverish rage, which gave a ferocious eloquence to his words. "But," Madame Danglars, resolving to make a last effort, "this young man, though a murderer, is an orphan, abandoned by everybody." "So much the worse, or rather, so much the better. It has been ordained that he may have none to weep his fate." "But this is trampling on the weak, sir." "The weakness of a murderer." "His dishonor reflects upon us." "Is death not in my house?" "Oh, sir!" exclaimed the Baroness, "you are without pity for others. Well, then, I tell you, they will have no mercy on you." "Be it so!" said Villefort, raising his arms to heaven. "At least, delay the trial till the next assizes. We shall have 6 months before us." "No, madame," said Villefort. "Instructions have been given. There are yet 5 days left. 5 days are more than I require. Do you not think that I also long for forgetfulness? While working night and day, I sometimes lose all recollection of the past, and then I experience the same sort of happiness I can imagine the dead feel. Still, it is better than suffering. But, sir, he has fled. Let him escape. Inaction is a pardonable offense. I tell you it is too late. Early this morning the telegraph was employed, and at this very minute—" "Sir," said the valet de chambre, entering the room, "a dragoon has brought this dispatch from the Minister of the Interior." Villefort seized the letter and hastily broke the seal. Madame Danglars trembled with fear. Villefort started with joy. "Arrested!" he exclaimed. "He was taken at Compiègne, and all is over." Madame Danglars rose from her seat, pale and cold. "Adieu, sir," she said. "Adieu, madame," replied the king's attorney, as in an almost joyful manner he conducted her to the door. Then, turning to his desk, he said, striking the letter with the back of his hand, "Come, I have had a forgery, 3 robberies, and 2 cases of arson. I only wanted a murder, and here it is. It will be a splendid session." End of chapter 99.
This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recorded by Sam Fuld. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 100. The Apparition. As the procureur had told Madame Danglars, Valentine was not yet recovered. Bowed down with fatigue, she was indeed confined to her bed, and it was in her own room, and from the lips of Madame de Villefort, that she heard all the strange events we have related. We mean the flight of Eugénie, and the arrest of Andrea Cavalcanti, or rather Benedetto, together with the accusation of murder pronounced against him. But Valentine was so weak that this recital scarcely produced the same effect it would have done had she been in her usual state of health. Indeed, her brain was only the seat of vague ideas, and confused forms, mingled with strange fancies, alone presented themselves before her eyes. During the daytime, Valentine's perceptions remained tolerably clear, owing to the constant presence of Monsieur Noirtier, who caused himself to be carried to his granddaughter's room, and watched her with his paternal tenderness. Villefort also, on his return from the law courts, frequently passed an hour or 2 with his father and child. At 6 o'clock, Villefort retired to his study. At 8, Monsieur d'Avrigny himself arrived, bringing the night draught prepared for the young girl, and then Monsieur Noirtier was carried away. A nurse of the doctor's choice succeeded them, and never left till about 10 or 11 o'clock, when Valentine was then asleep. As she went downstairs, she gave the keys of Valentine's room to Monsieur de Villefort, so that no one could reach the sick room excepting through that of Madame de Villefort and little Edward. Every morning Morrel called on Noirtier to receive news of Valentine, and, extraordinary as it seemed, each day found him less uneasy. Certainly, though Valentine still laboured under dreadful nervous excitement, she was better, and moreover, Monte Cristo had told him when, half distracted, he had rushed to the Count's house, that if she were not dead in 2 hours she would be saved. Now, 4 days had elapsed, and Valentine still lived. The nervous excitement of which we speak pursued Valentine even in her sleep, or rather in that state of somnolence which succeeded her waking hours. It was then, in the silence of night, in the dim light shed from the alabaster lamp on the chimney-piece, that she saw the shadows pass and repass which hover over the bed of sickness, and fan the fever with their trembling wings. First she fancied she saw her stepmother threatening her. Then Morrel stretched his arms towards her. Sometimes mere strangers, like the Count of Monte Cristo, came to visit her. Even the very furniture in these moments of delirium seemed to move, and this state lasted till about 3 o'clock in the morning, when a deep, heavy slumber overcame the young girl, from which she did not awake till daylight. On the evening of the day on which Valentine had learned of the flight of Eugénie and the arrest of Benedetto, Villefort having retired as well as Noirtier and d'Avrigny, her thoughts wandered in a confused maze, alternatively reviewing her own situation and the events she had just heard. 11 o'clock had struck. The nurse, having placed the beverage prepared by the doctor within reach of the patient, and locked the door, was listening with terror to the comments of the servants in the kitchen, and storing her memory with all the horrible stories which had for some months past amused the occupants of the antechambers in the house of the king's attorney. Meanwhile, an unexpected scene was passing in the room which had been so carefully locked. 10 minutes had elapsed since the nurse had left. Valentine, who for the last hour had been suffering from the fever which returned nightly, incapable of controlling her ideas, was forced to yield to the excitement which exhausted itself in producing and reproducing a succession and recurrence of the same fancies and images. The night lamp threw out countless rays, each resolving itself into some new form to her disordered imagination, when suddenly by its flickering light Valentine thought she saw the door of her library, which was in the recess by the chimney-piece, open slowly, though she in vain listened for the sound of the hinges on which it turned. At any other time Valentine would have seized the silken bell-pull and summoned assistance, but nothing astonished her in her present situation. Her reason told her that all the visions she beheld were but the children of her imagination, and the conviction was strengthened by the fact that in the morning no traces remained of the nocturnal phantoms, who disappeared with the coming of daylight. From behind the door a human figure appeared, but the girl was too familiar with such apparitions to be alarmed, and therefore only stared, hoping to recognize Morrel. The figure advanced towards the bed, and appeared to listen with profound attention. At this moment a ray of light glanced across the face of the midnight visitor. "It is not he," she murmured, and waited, in the assurance that this was but a dream, for the man to disappear or assume some other form. Still, she felt her pulse, and finding it throb violently, she remembered that the best method of dispelling such illusions was to drink, for a draught of the beverage prepared by the doctor to allay her fever seemed to cause a reaction of the brain, and for a short time she suffered less. Valentine, therefore, reached her hand towards the glass, but as soon as her trembling arm left the bed, the apparition advanced more quickly towards her, and approached the young girl so closely that she fancied she heard its breath, and felt the pressure of his hand. This time the illusion, or rather the reality, surpassed anything Valentine had before experienced. She began to believe herself really alive and awake, and the belief that her reason was this time not deceived made her shudder. The pressure she felt was evidently intended to arrest her arm, and she slowly withdrew it. Then the figure, from whom she could not detach her eyes, and who appeared more protecting than menacing, took the glass, and walking towards the nightlight held it up, as if to test its transparency. This did not seem sufficient. The man, or rather the ghost, for he trod so softly that no sound was heard, then poured out about a spoonful into the glass, and drank it. Valentine witnessed this scene with a sentiment of stupefaction. Every minute she had expected that it would vanish and give place to another vision, but the man, instead of dissolving like a shadow, again approached her, and said in an agitated voice, "Now you may drink." Valentine shuddered. It was the first time one of these visions had ever addressed her in a living voice, and she was about to utter an exclamation. The man placed his finger on her lips. "The Count of Monte Cristo," she murmured. It was easy to see that no doubt now remained in the young girl's mind as to the reality of the scene. Her eyes started with terror, her hands trembled, and she rapidly drew the bedclothes closer to her. Still, the presence of Monte Cristo at such an hour, his mysterious, fanciful, and extraordinary entrance into her room through the wall, might well seem impossibilities to her shattered reason. "Do not call anyone. Do not be alarmed," said the Count. "Do not let a shade of suspicion or uneasiness remain in your breast. The man standing before you, Valentine, for this time it is no ghost, is nothing more than the tenderest father and the most respectful friend you could dream of." Valentine could not reply. The voice which indicated the real presence of a being in the room alarmed her so much that she feared to utter a syllable. Still the expression of her eyes seemed to inquire, "If your intentions are pure, why are you here?" The Count's marvellous sagacity understood all that was passing in the young girl's mind. Listen to me, he said, or rather, look upon me, look at my face, paler even than usual, and my eyes, red with weariness. For 4 days I have not closed them, for I have been constantly watching you, to protect and preserve you for Maximilian. The blood mounted rapidly to the cheeks of Valentine, for the name just announced by the Count dispelled all the fear with which his presence had inspired her. "Maximilian!" she exclaimed, and so sweet did the sound appear to her that she repeated it. "Maximilian! Has he then owned all to you?" "Everything. He told me your life was his, and I have promised him that you shall live." "You have promised him that I shall live?" "Yes." "But, sir, you spoke of vigilance and protection. Are you a doctor?" "Yes, the best you could have at the present time, believe me." "But you say you have watched?" said Valentine uneasily. "Where have you been? I have not seen you." The Count extended his hand towards the library. "I was hidden behind that door," he said, "which leads into the next house, which I have rented." Valentine turned her eyes away, and, with an indignant expression of pride and modest fear, exclaimed, "Sir, I think you have been guilty of an unparalleled intrusion, and that what you call protection is more like an insult." "Valentine," he answered, "during my long watch over you, all I have observed has been what people visited you, what nourishment was prepared, and what beverage was served. Then, when the latter appeared dangerous to me, I entered, as I have now done, and substituted, in the place of the poison, a healthful draught, which, instead of producing the death intended, caused life to circulate in your veins." "Poison? Death?" exclaimed Valentine, half believing herself under the influence of some feverish hallucination. "What are you saying, sir?" "Hush, my child," said Monte Cristo, again placing his finger upon her lips. "I did say poison and death, but drink some of this." And the Count took a bottle from his pocket, containing a red liquid, of which he poured a few drops into the glass. "Drink this, and then take nothing more tonight." Valentine stretched out her hand, but scarcely had she touched the glass when she drew back in fear. Monte Cristo took the glass, drank half of its contents, and then presented it to Valentine, who smiled and swallowed the rest. "Oh yes," she exclaimed, "I recognize the flavour of my nocturnal beverage, which refreshed me so much, and seemed to ease my aching brain. Thank you, sir, thank you." "This is how you have lived during the last 4 nights, Valentine," said the Count. "But, oh, how I passed that time! Oh, the wretched hours I have endured! The torture to which I have submitted when I saw the deadly poison poured into your glass! And how I trembled lest you should drink it before I could find time to throw it away!" "Sir," said Valentine, at the height of her terror, "you say you endured tortures when you saw the deadly poison poured into my glass. But if you saw this, you must also have seen the person who poured it." "Yes." Valentine raised herself in bed, and drew over her chest, which appeared whiter than snow, the embroidered cambric, still moist with the cold dews of delirium, to which were now added those of terror. "You saw the person?" repeated the young girl. "Yes," repeated the Count. "What you tell me is horrible, sir. You wish to make me believe something too dreadful. What? Attempt to murder me in my father's house, in my room, on my bed of sickness? Oh, leave me, sir. You are tempting me. You make me doubt the goodness of Providence. It is impossible. It cannot be." "Are you the first that this hand has stricken? Have you not seen Monsieur de Saint-Méran, Madame de Saint-Méran, Barrois, all fall? Would not Monsieur Noirtier also have fallen a victim, had not the treatment he has been pursuing for the last 3 years neutralized the effects of the poison?" "Oh, heaven!" said Valentine. Is this the reason why Grandpapa has made me share all his beverages during the last month? And have they all tasted of a slightly bitter flavour, like that of dried orange peel? Oh, yes, yes. Then that explains all, said Monte Cristo. Your grandfather knows, then, that a poisoner lives here, perhaps even suspects the person. He has been fortifying you, his beloved child, against the fatal effects of the poison, which has failed because your system was already impregnated with it. But even this would have availed little against a more deadly medium of death employed 4 days ago, which is generally but too fatal. But who, then, is this assassin, this murderer? Let me also ask you a question. Have you never seen anyone enter your room at night? Oh, yes. I have frequently seen shadows pass close to me, approach, and disappear, but I took them for visions raised by my feverish imagination, and indeed, when you entered I thought I was under the influence of delirium. Then you do not know who it is that attempts your life? No, said Valentine. Who could desire my death? You shall know it now, then, said Monte Cristo, listening. How do you mean? Said Valentine, looking anxiously around. Because you are not feverish or delirious tonight, but thoroughly awake. Midnight is striking, which is the hour the murderers choose. Oh, heavens! Exclaimed Valentine, wiping off the drops which ran down her forehead. Midnight struck, slowly and sadly. Every hour seemed to strike with leaden weight upon the heart of the poor girl. Valentine, said the Count, summon up all your courage. Still the beatings of your heart. Do not let a sound escape you, and feign to be asleep. Then you will see. Valentine seized the Count's hand. I think I hear a noise, she said. Leave me. Goodbye, for the present, replied the Count, walking upon tiptoe towards the library door, and smiling with an expression so sad and paternal that the young girl's heart was filled with gratitude. Before closing the door, he turned around once more and said, Not a movement, not a word. Let them think you're asleep, or perhaps you may be killed before I have the power of helping you. And with this fearful injunction, the Count disappeared through the door, which noiselessly closed after him. End of chapter.
This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Nicole Carl, St. Louis, Missouri, October 2007. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 101. Locusta. Valentine was alone. 2 other clocks, slower than that of Saint Philippe du Roule, struck the hour of midnight from different directions, and excepting the rumbling of a few carriages, all was silent. Then Valentine's attention was engrossed by the clock in her room, which marked the seconds. She began counting them, remarking that they were much slower than the beatings of her heart, and still she doubted. The inoffensive Valentine could not imagine that any one should desire her death. Why should they? To what end? And what had she done to excite the malice of an enemy? There was no fear in her falling asleep. One terrible idea pressed upon her mind, that some one existed in the world who had attempted to assassinate her, and who was about to endeavor to do so again. Supposing this person, wearied at the inefficacy of the poison, should, as Monte Cristo intimated, have recourse to steel. What if the Count should have no time to run to her rescue? What if her last moments were approaching, and she should never again see Morel? When this terrible chain of ideas presented itself, Valentine was nearly persuaded to ring the bell and call for help. But through the door she fancied she saw the luminous eye of the Count, that eye which lived in her memory, and the recollection overwhelmed her with so much shame that she asked herself whether any amount of gratitude could ever repay his adventurous and devoted friendship. 20 minutes, 20 tedious minutes passed thus, then 10 more, and at last the clock struck the half-hour. Just then the sound of fingernails slightly grating against the door of the library informed Valentine that the Count was still watching, and recommended her to do the same. At the same time, on the opposite side, that is, toward Edward's room, Valentine fancied that she heard the creaking of the floor. She listened attentively, holding her breath till she was nearly suffocated. The clock turned, and the door slowly opened. Valentine had raised herself upon her elbow, and had scarcely time to throw herself down on the bed and shade her eyes with her arm, then, trembling, agitated, and her heart beating with indescribable terror, she awaited the event. Some one approached the bed and drew back the curtains. Valentine summoned every effort and breathed with that regular respiration which announces tranquil sleep. "Valentine," said a low voice. Still silent, Valentine had promised not to wake. Then everything was still, excepting that Valentine heard the almost noiseless sound of some liquid being poured into the glass she had just emptied. Then she ventured to open her eyelids and glance over her extended arm. She saw a woman in a white dressing gown pouring a liquid from a vial into her glass. During this short time Valentine must have held her breath, or moved in some slight degree, for the woman, disturbed, stopped and leaned over the bed, in order the better to ascertain whether Valentine slept. It was Madame de Dillifort. On recognizing her stepmother, Valentine could not repress a shudder, which caused a vibration in the bed. Madame de Dillifort instantly stepped back close to the wall, and there, shaded by the bed curtains, she silently and attentively watched the slightest movement of Valentine. The latter recollected the terrible caution of the Monte Cristo. She fancied that the hand, not holding the vial, clasped a long, sharp knife. Then, collecting all her remaining strength, she forced herself to close her eyes. But this simple operation upon the most delicate organs of our frame, generally so easy to accomplish, became almost impossible at this moment. So much did curiosity struggle to retain the eyelid open and learn the truth. Madame de Dillifort, however, reassured by the silence, which was alone disturbed by the regular breathing of Valentine, again extended her hand, and half hidden by the curtains, succeeded in emptying the contents of the vial into the glass. Then she retired so gently that Valentine did not know she had left the room. She only witnessed the withdrawal of the arm, the fair round arm of a woman but 25 years old, who had yet spread death around her. It is impossible to describe the sensations experienced by Valentine during the minute and a half Madame de Dillifort remained in the room. The grating against the library door aroused the young girl from the stupor in which she was plunged, and which almost amounted to insensibility. She raised her head with an effort. The noiseless door again turned on its hinges, and the Count of Monte Cristo reappeared. "Well," said he, "do you still doubt?" "Oh," murmured the young girl. "Have you seen?" "Alas!" "Did you recognize?" Valentine groaned. "Oh, yes," she said, "I saw, but I cannot believe." "You would rather die, then, and cause Maximilian's death?" "Oh," repeated the young girl, almost bewildered, "can I not leave the house? Can I not escape?" "Valentine, the hand which now threatens you will pursue you everywhere. Your servants will be seduced with gold, and death will be offered to you disguised in every shape. You will find it in the water you drink from the spring, in the fruit you pluck from the tree." "But did you not say that my kind grandfather's precaution had neutralized the poison?" "Yes, but not against a strong dose. The poison will be changed and the quantity increased." He took the glass and raised it to his lips. "It is already done," he said. "Brucine is no longer employed, but a simple narcotic. I can recognize the flavor of the alcohol in which it has been dissolved. If you had taken what Madame de Dillifort has poured into your glass, Valentine, you would have been doomed." "But," exclaimed the young girl, "why am I thus pursued?" "Why? You are so kind, so good, so unsuspicious of ill, that you cannot understand Valentine? No, I have never injured her." But you are rich, Valentine. You have 200,000 livres a year, and you prevent her son from enjoying those 200,000 livres. How so? The fortune is not her gift, but is inherited from my relations. Certainly, and that is why Monsieur and Madame de Saint-Méran have died. That is why Monsieur Noirtier was sentenced the day he made you his heir. That is why you, in your turn, are to die. It is because your father would inherit your property, and your brother, his only son, succeed to his. Edward? Poor child! Are all these crimes committed on his account? Ah, then you at length understand. Heaven grant that this may not be visited upon him. Valentine, you are an angel. But why is my grandfather allowed to live? It was considered that you dead, the fortune would naturally revert to your brother, unless he were disinherited, and besides, the crime appearing useless, it would be folly to commit it. And is it possible that this frightful combination of crimes has been invented by a woman? Do you recollect in the arbor of the Hotel de Poste at Perugia, seeing a man in a brown cloak, whom your stepmother was questioning upon Aqua Tofana? Well, ever since then, the infernal project has been ripening in her brain. Ah, then, indeed, sir, said the sweet girl, bathed in tears, I see that I am condemned to die. No, Valentine, for I have foreseen all their plots. No, your enemy is conquered since we know her, and you will live, Valentine, live to be happy yourself, and to confer happiness upon a noble heart. But to ensure this you must rely on me. Command me, sir. What am I to do? You must blindly take what I give you. Alas, were it only for my sake, I should prefer to die. You must not confide in anyone, not even in your father. My father is not engaged in this fearful plot, is he, sir? Asked Valentine, clasping her hands. No, and yet your father, a man accustomed to judicial accusations, ought to have known that all these deaths have not happened naturally. It is he who should have watched over you. He should have occupied my place. He should have emptied that glass. He should have risen against the assassin, spectre against spectre, he murmured in a low voice as he concluded his sentence. Sir, said Valentine, I will do all I can to live, for there are two things whose existence depends on mine, my grandfather and Maximilian. I will watch over them as I have over you. Well, sir, do as you will with me. And then she added in a low voice, O heavens, what will befall me? Whatever may happen, Valentine, do not be alarmed. Though you suffer, though you lose sight, hearing, consciousness, fear nothing. Though you should awake and be ignorant where you are, still do not fear. Even though you should find yourself in a sepulchral vault or coffin, reassure yourself then, and say to yourself, at this moment a friend, a father, who lives for my happiness and that of Maximilian watches over me. Alas, alas, what a fearful extremity! Valentine, would you rather denounce your stepmother? I would rather die 100 times. Oh, yes, die! No, you will not die, but you will promise me, whatever happens, that you will not complain. But hope? I will think of Maximilian. You are my own darling child, Valentine. I alone can save you, and I will. Valentine, in the extremity of her terror, joined her hands, for she felt that the moment had arrived to ask for courage, and began to pray, and while uttering little more than incoherent words, she forgot that her white shoulders had no other covering than her long hair, and that the pulsations of her heart could be seen through the lace of her nightdress. Monte Cristo gently laid his hand on the young girl's arm, drew the velvet coverlet close to her throat, and said with a paternal smile, My child, believe in my devotion to you as you believe in the goodness of Providence and the love of Maximilian. Then he drew from his waistcoat pocket a little emerald box, raised the gold lid, and took from it a pastille about the size of a pea, which he placed in her hand. She took it, and looked attentively on the Count. There was an expression on the face of her intrepid protector which commanded her veneration. She evidently interrogated him by her look. "Yes," said he. Valentine carried the pastille to her mouth and swallowed it. "And now, my dear child, adieu for the present. I will try and gain a little sleep, for you are saved." "Go," said Valentine. "Whatever happens, I promise you not to fear." Monte Cristo for some time kept his eyes fixed on the young girl, who gradually fell asleep, yielding to the effects of the narcotic the Count had given her. Then he took the glass, emptied 3 parts of the contents in the fireplace, that it might be supposed Valentine had taken it, and replaced it on the table. Then he disappeared, after throwing a farewell glance on Valentine, who slept with the confidence and innocence of an angel. End of chapter 101.
This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Recorded by Christy Nowak. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas, Chapter 102. Valentine. The nightlight continued to burn on the chimney-piece, exhausting the last drops of oil which floated on the surface of the water. The globe of the lamp appeared of a reddish hue, and the flame, brightening before it expired, threw out the last flickerings which, in an inanimate object, have been so often compared with the convulsions of a human creature in its final agonies. A dull and dismal light was shed over the bedclothes and curtains surrounding the young girl. All noise in the streets had ceased, and the silence was frightful. It was then that the door of Edward's room opened, and a head we have before noticed appeared in the glass opposite. It was Madame de Villefort, who came to witness the effects of the drink she had prepared. She stopped in the doorway, listened for a moment to the flickering of the lamp, the only sound in that deserted room, and then advanced to the table to see if Valentine's glass were empty. It was still about a quarter full, as we before stated. Madame de Villefort emptied the contents into the ashes, which she disturbed that they might more readily absorb the liquid. Then she carefully rinsed the glass, and, wiping it with her handkerchief, replaced it on the table. If anyone could have looked into the room just then, he would have noticed the hesitation with which Madame Villefort approached the bed and looked fixedly on Valentine. The dim light, the profound silence, and the gloomy thoughts inspired by the hour, and still more by her own conscience, all combined to produce a sensation of fear. The poisoner was terrified at the contemplation of her own work. At length she rallied, drew aside the curtain, and leaning over the pillow gazed intently on Valentine. The young girl no longer breathed. No breath issued through the half-closed teeth. The white lips no longer quivered. The eyes were suffused with a bluish vapor, and the long black lashes rested on a cheek white as wax. Madame de Villefort gazed upon the face, so expressive even in its stillness. Then she ventured to raise the coverlet and pressed her hand upon the young girl's heart. It was cold and motionless. She only felt the pulsation of her own fingers, and withdrew her hand with a shudder. One arm was hanging out of the bed. From shoulder to elbow it was molded after the arms of Germain Pilon's Graces, but the forearm seemed to be slightly distorted by convulsions, and the hand, so delicately formed, was resting with stiff, outstretched fingers on the framework of the bed. The nails, too, were turning blue. Madame de Villefort had no longer any doubt. All was over. She had consummated the last terrible work she had to accomplish. There was no more to do in the room, so the poisoner retired stealthily, as though fearing to hear the sound of her own footsteps. But as she withdrew, she still held aside the curtain, absorbed in the irresistible attraction always exerted by the picture of death, so long as it is merely mysterious and does not excite disgust. Just then the lamp again flickered. The noise startled Madame de Villefort, who shuddered and dropped the curtain. Immediately afterwards the light expired, and the room was plunged in frightful obscurity, while the clock at the minute struck 4:30. Overpowered with agitation, the poisoner succeeded in groping her way to the door, and reached her room in an agony of fear. The darkness lasted 2 hours longer. Then, by degrees, a cold light crept through the Venetian blinds, until at length it revealed the objects in the room. About this time the nurse's cough was heard on the stairs, and the woman entered the room with a cup in her hand. To the tender eye of a father or a lover, The first glance would have sufficed to reveal Valentine's condition, but to this hireling Valentine only appeared to sleep. "Good!" she exclaimed, approaching the table. "She has taken part of her draught. The glass is 3/4 empty." Then she went to the fireplace and lit the fire, and although she had just left her bed, she could not resist the temptation offered by Valentine's sleep, so she threw herself into an armchair to snatch a little more rest. The clock, striking 8, awoke her. Astonished at the prolonged slumber of the patient, and frightened to see that the arm was still hanging out of the bed, she advanced towards Valentine, and for the first time noticed the white lips. She tried to replace the arm, but it moved with a frightful rigidity which could not deceive a sick nurse. She screamed aloud, then, running to the door, exclaimed, "Help! Help!" "What is the matter?" asked Monsieur d'Avrigny at the foot of the stairs, it being the hour he usually visited her. "What is it?" asked Villefort, rushing from his room. "Doctor, do you hear them call for help?" Yes, let us hasten up. It was in Valentine's room." But before the doctor and the father could reach the room, the servants, who were on the same floor, had entered, and seeing Valentine pale and motionless on her bed, they lifted up their hands towards heaven and stood transfixed as though struck by lightning. "Wake Madame de Villefort!" cried the procureur from the door of his chamber, which apparently he scarcely dared to leave. But instead of obeying him, the servant stood watching Monsieur d'Avrigny, who ran to Valentine and raised her in his arms. "What? This one too?" he exclaimed. "Oh, where will be the end?" Villefort rushed into the room. "What are you saying, doctor?" he exclaimed, raising his hands to heaven. "I say that Valentine is dead," replied d'Avrigny in a voice terrible in its solemn calm. Monsieur de Villefort staggered and buried his head in the bed. On the exclamation of the doctor and the cry of the father, the servants all fled with muttered imprecations. They were heard running down the stairs and through the long passages. Then there was a rush in the court. Afterwards all was still. They had, one and all, deserted the accursed house. Just then, Madame de Villefort, in the act of slipping on her dressing-gown, threw aside the drapery and, for a moment, stood motionless, as though interrogating the occupants of the room, while she endeavoured to call up some rebellious tears. On a sudden she stepped, or rather bounded, with outstretched arms toward the table. She saw d'Avrigny curiously examining the glass, which she felt certain of having emptied during the night. It was now a third full, just as it was when she threw the contents into the ashes. The spectre of Valentine rising before the poisoner would have alarmed her less. It was, indeed, the same color as the draught she had poured into the glass, and which Valentine had drank. It was indeed the poison, which could not deceive Monsieur d'Avrigny, which he now examined so closely. It was doubtless a miracle from heaven that, notwithstanding her precautions, there should be some trace, some proof remaining to reveal the crime. While Madame de Villefort remained rooted to the spot like a statue of terror, and Villefort, with his head hidden in the bedclothes, saw nothing around him, d'Avrigny approached the window, that he might the better examine the contents of the glass, and dipping the tip of his finger in, tasted it. "Ah!" he exclaimed, "it is no longer brucine that is used. Let me see what it is." Then he ran to one of the cupboards in Valentine's room, which had been transformed into a medicine closet, and taking from its silver case a small bottle of nitric acid, dropped a little of it into the liquor, which immediately changed to a blood-red color. "Ah!" exclaimed d'Avrigny, in a voice in which the horror of a judge unveiling the truth was mingled with the delight of a student making a discovery. Madame de Villefort was overpowered. Her eyes first flashed and then swam. She staggered towards the door and disappeared. Directly afterwards the distant sound of a heavy weight falling on the ground was heard, but no one paid any attention to it. The nurse was engaged in watching the chemical analysis, and Villefort was still absorbed in grief. Monsieur d'Avrigny alone had followed Madame de Villefort with his eyes, and watched her hurried retreat. He lifted up the drapery over the entrance to Edward's room, and his eye reaching as far as Madame de Villefort's apartment, he beheld her extended, lifeless, on the floor. "Go to the assistance of Madame de Villefort," he said to the nurse. "Madame de Villefort is ill." "But Mademoiselle de Villefort," stammered the nurse. "Mademoiselle de Villefort no longer requires help," said d'Avrigny, "since she is dead." "Dead! Dead!" groaned forth Villefort in a paroxysm of grief, which was the more terrible from the novelty of the sensation in the iron heart of that man. "Dead!" repeated a third voice. "Who said Valentine was dead?" The two men turned round and saw Morel standing at the door, pale and terror-stricken. This is what had happened. At the usual time, Morel had presented himself at the little door leading to Noirtier's room. Contrary to custom, the door was open, and having no occasion to ring, he entered. He waited for a moment in the hall, and called for a servant to conduct him to Monsieur Noirtier. But no one answered, the servants having, as we know, deserted the house. Morel had no particular reason for uneasiness. Monte Cristo had promised him that Valentine should live, and so far he had always fulfilled his word. Every night the Count had given him news, which was the next morning confirmed by Noirtier. Still, this extraordinary silence appeared strange to him, and he called a second and third time. Still no answer. Then he determined to go up. Noirtier's room was opened, like all the rest. The first thing he saw was the old man sitting in his armchair in his usual place, but his eyes expressed alarm, which was confirmed by the pallor which overspread his features. "How are you, sir?" asked Morel with a sickness of heart. "Well," answered the old man, by closing his eyes, but his appearance manifested increasing uneasiness. "You are thoughtful, sir," continued Morel. "You want something. Shall I call one of the servants?" "Yes," replied Noirtier. Morel pulled the bell, but though he nearly broke the cord, no one answered. He turned towards Noirtier. The pallor and anguish expressed on his countenance momentarily increased. "Oh!" exclaimed Morel, "why do they not come? Is anyone ill in the house?" The eyes of Noirtier seemed as though they would start from their sockets. "What is the matter? You alarm me. Valentine? Valentine?" "Yes, yes," sighed Noirtier. Maximilien tried to speak, but he could articulate nothing. He staggered and supported himself against the wainscot. Then he pointed to the door. "Yes, yes, yes," continued the old man. Maximilien rushed up the little staircase, while Noirtier's eyes seemed to say, "Quicker, quicker!" In a minute the young man darted through several rooms, till at length he reached Valentine's. There was no occasion to push the door. It was wide open. A sob was the only sound he heard. He saw, as though in a mist, a black figure kneeling and buried in a confused mass of white drapery. A terrible fear transfixed him. It was then he heard a voice exclaim, "Valentine is dead!" and another voice, which, like an echo, repeat, "Dead! Dead!" End of chapter 102.